How's it going? What? I didn't hear you. What is up, Breaking Out? This is the tech panel. Whoop, whoop. So my name is Deanna Zandt. I'm the co-founder and partner of Lux Digital. You have our full bios in your programs and materials, but just to give you a little bit of overview of who we all are and why on earth we're sitting on this stage in front of you to talk to you today. We'll just give you a little brief overview, and then we're going to jump right into the hard stuff. Lux Digital is my agency here in New York. We create measurable emotional resonance, and relevant for this room is we work with the Ford Foundation, the Skoll Foundation. We've worked with the Harnish Foundation and Open Society Foundations. And we have a really good time. And I also wrote a book called Share This! How you will change the world with social networking. It came out 4 years ago, which makes it really weird now, and we talk about things like the MySpace. It's not awkward at all, and it's great. So I'm here to lead this conversation about the intersection of technology and philanthropy today, and how are we reinventing, how are we rethinking technology and philanthropy together. And one of the really interesting things as we've been discussing what we wanted to cover today, to me, is there's sort of two main things that people are thinking about. How can technology continue to support philanthropists in the work that they're doing already? And how can we as technologists help the funding community and the philanthropy community rethink what the future actually looks like because of technology restructuring everything that we're doing our entire lives. So with that, I'm just going to lead right in because I've got four really, really, really smart people who I just adore. I had a little coffee this morning. Needed it after last night, if you know what I mean. And we're going to jump right in. So right here to my left, this is Rose Broome. She is the co-founder and CEO of HandUp, a crowdfunding site that lets you donate directly to specific homeless people and other neighbors in need. Previously, Rose managed data for the Barack Obama 2008 presidential campaign, and in early 2014, she was named what? One of the top 100 people in tech by Business Insider. Yay! So that's Rose, and Rose is going to show us a little video and talk to us about some of her work today.
Cool, thanks.
And we can watch the video.
I became paralyzed in a motorbike accident as a young adult. Through that journey of obtaining a new body, I found sports. I was dancing for an internationally renowned dance troupe here in the Bay Area. And last year, I was laid off from the dance company and I ended up homeless. So I went from 5 backpacks to 4 backpacks to 1 backpack because it helped me not only letting go of things I own, my possessions, but just letting go of emotions and regrets that I had. When I was homeless, I went to Pier 1 and Pier 7, lied on the benches down there, and I could tell you this beautiful sights in the morning. The fog would come in and these seagulls would come down through the fog like these angels coming down, and I used to have the seagull come visit me down there with one leg, and I named it Ocean, or Moana in my language. I used to see ocean every morning. That was the time of really crucial healing for me. I was around people that had been on the street for a long time, most of their lives. They're people who lost their families, you know. So there's a real deep humbleness that come with that. Recently, I've found myself in a really beautiful place, and 90% of that is the reason is because of HandUp. They gave me this huge opportunity to like get back up on my wheels, I should say. This is the great thing about HandUp. You get this opportunity to reach out to friends, to do a short video and get a profile. It's very professional, be able to look at this website, boom, okay, I believe. And then I accumulated funds to get a laptop within a couple of weeks so that I could find employment in dance. They not only supported me financially, but a lot of them supported me emotionally as well. They've sort of opened me up as a person again, because I feel like people care, you know? I hope to inspire and uplift our community of disabled young youth, because we all can dance, and it's just having that little lift up, or that hand up, I should say.
Thanks so much, everyone. So I'm Rose, one of the co-founders of HandUp, and just want to give you guys a little bit of background of how we started. Actually, two people who made a big difference in helping us get off the ground are in this room. So I'll weave them into my story. So a lot of people ask me how I got the idea from HandUp, so I'll start there. It was a cold winter night. I was walking down the street in San Francisco. We often we complain about being cold, but it's never so cold that we have to wear gloves. And this was one of those nights. And I passed a woman who was sleeping on the sidewalk, and I asked myself why. Why in a society with so much wealth, innovation, and compassion, why we still have people sleeping on the streets at night. And in San Francisco, we have about 7,000 homeless people in our city, and around 4,000 of them are unsheltered. And I wanted to do something about that. And being a tech person, I started thinking about, I asked myself, why can I pull my phone out? I can call an Uber, I can order Grubhub, I can do all these things with my phone, but I can't do something right here in this moment to help this woman. And I started brainstorming and thinking, what would that look like? What would it look like to be able to pull your phone out and help somebody? And told this to a friend of mine who's an engineer, and he shocked me by saying, well, if you get it all set up, I'll build it for you. And he didn't know what he was getting himself into, and I certainly didn't know what I was getting myself into either. And we bumped into a group of people who had a similar idea. One of them is here in this room, Donnie Sandoval, who you'll hear from later as well. And we got this project off the ground. And we also bumped into a woman in this room, Clara, who's working on who has an incubator called Tummel that's focused on urban innovation startups. And I randomly went to an event they had, and she says, met up with them, and they said, we would love for you guys to apply for our incubator. Literally, the thought of doing this full time had not crossed my mind before they invited us to apply. And that was over a year ago now. We launched HandUp on August 15th, and now we've been up and off the ground. One thing that makes us different is we're a benefit corporation, so we are for profit, but we also have a legally binding social mission. And we, a few months ago, closed our seed funding, and now we're expanding. So now we're we just launched in Detroit and in a couple places in Oregon as well. So I have a lot more to share with you all, but I think I'm approaching the end of my time.
Talk a little bit about, or tell us, do this, because I'm in charge. Tell us a little bit about your kind of funding experiences and what that's been like as an entrepreneur entering into the space.
Yeah. So when we first started fundraising for HandUp, we were very early stage. We had a small pilot that was running. We didn't have, years or even months of metrics. And we faced the challenge that Clara brought up in her question earlier, which was, as an very early stage organization, getting support. And so initially I thought, because we're a tech company and we have a social mission, I thought we will be able to raise some money from philanthropists, some from foundations, some from tech investors, some from angel investors, and I wanted a really broad spectrum of funders so we could have access to all kinds of knowledge and networks. And what we found from the very beginning was that most of the interest that we got was from traditional tech angel investors. And this really surprised me. And I think part of the reason is because we were so early stage, there was a lot of risk. Angel investors are investing their own money, and they have this freedom to say, you know what, you have some great traction. I love you and your team. I believe in you guys. I think this is great. Here's some money. Go and see what you can do. And so we were able to, start raising from the angel community. We have a lot of really great tech angel investors. Ron Conway, Jason Calacanis was our first investor, Eric Reese of the Lean Startup, and then some kind of impact organizations as well, like Tummel 1776 in DC, Urban.us, and hope to, as we grow, find support from within the philanthropic community as well, to have even more knowledge and access to networks around our social mission.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of Nancy Lublin of Do Something gave a talk at Personal Democracy Forum either last year or the year before, and one of the things that they said that they ran into with the challenges is that in the philanthropy community, the structure of philanthropic organizations meant they often got the answer, we love what you're doing, but you don't fit into any of our buckets. And because we're entrepreneurs and innovators, her answer to that was, well, yeah, no kidding, what I'm doing is brand new, and so that's this dilemma that we face. And thinking about that as both technologists and philanthropists, I'd love if we could kind of dig into some of those questions.
Can I have one little note on that?
No, yes.
Yes, I would hear that a lot from different foundations and philanthropists that I spoke with. I love what you're doing. This is even more, creating more of a social impact than many of the, the organizations that I grant to, but because you're a for-profit or because you're a tech platform, you don't fit within our portfolio, or because you're so early stage. And hearing things, this is so painful for an entrepreneur to hear. We have so much money that we can't make small investments. When you're at a later stage, come back. Oh. Sorry, it really hurts. I would love, one thing that I would love to see in the foundation philanthropic community is more adoption of the angel model. Partners who have the freedom to invest small money, $10,000, $20,000, $100,000, without a funding cycle, without any kind of restrictions, requirements, just distribute money faster to earlier stage organizations. Because that early money makes a huge difference for entrepreneurs when you can't pay your rent.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rose. Yay. Next up, we're going to hear from Shaunna Thomas. She's the co-founder and co-director of UltraViolet, whoop, whoop, an online-based women's rights organization. Shaunna started UltraViolet with her co-founder, Nita Chaudhry, after years of work representing major online groups on Capitol Hill. And Shaunna is also going to show us a little video.
Very different kind of video.
We like variety.
Yeah.
Not awkward at all.
Hey, Liz. I'm not trying to get involved in your private life or anything, but I was going through your desk and I found these. Oh, Liz, don't you know birth control is abortion?
But it isn't abortion.
Look, Liz, your boss shouldn't have to pay for all those abortions.
Well, good talking to you. Liz. How's it going?
You? Where's the pharmacist?
I was worried you would try something like this.
But I really need that for my endometriosis.
We just don't think we should have to pay for you to have sex with Dennis.
You aren't paying for sex with Dennis. The insurance company pays for my birth control, and neither of us are paying to have sex with Dennis.
No.
Hey, Liz. Oh, God, you have to take birth control every single day? You must be having a lot of sex with Dennis.
You know, a lot of women choose not to have sex or they choose to have children.
We have 2 kids downstairs. You have no right to be here. Oh, sorry, honey. This is my boss and some judge.
Don't forget, Liz, it's not about your rights or your health. It's about your boss's personal freedom.
Conservatives want the Supreme Court to let your boss into your bedroom. Women deserve to make their own healthcare decisions. Take action at weareultraviolet.org/boss.
Yes. Puppets. Puppets for the win, Shaunna. Take it away. Tell us a little bit about philanthropy and puppets.
Sure. Yeah, puppets have sort of a cult following these days. So I'm Shaunna Thomas. I co-founded and now co-direct UltraViolet with my partner Nita Chaudhry. So we launched UltraViolet in February of 2012. Just like quickly on the backstory of that, neither one of us were working specifically in the women's rights space per se. Nita had been campaigns director at Move On for 7 years, working mostly on their anti-war work. And I had been representing Move On, Democracy for America, Progressive Change Campaign Committee. These big, powerful online communities have been built by people like Nita and others online, connecting those groups with Capitol Hill, with progressives in Congress to make big pieces of legislation as progressive and responsive to people and their constituents as possible. And one of the lessons that Nita and I kept learning over and over and over again was that if you wanted to pass a major piece of legislation in this country, even when Democrats were in charge of the White House and both chambers in Congress, you essentially have to throw women's rights under the bus to do it. So not only did we need an abortion writer to pass the health care bill, we also needed abortion writers to pass things like tax cuts. So like the most politically expedient thing to do.
Because that actually makes, taxes and abortions, womp womp, that's how it rolls.
Right. Oh, how do we get this tax bill? I see. We're just going to make it harder for women to get abortions all over the country. So we looked at that problem and said, that's a dynamic we would like to be a part of fixing. What's happening here? Why is this? There is a fairly substantial kind of infrastructure that has been built over decades around policy, advocacy, and direct service in the women's rights community. And yet, with all of the technology advancements that we've been applying to issues from economic populist agendas to Social Security, to the environment, which was this rapid response, online-based, using these rapid response online-based tools for affecting change in the moment that that the change is needed. We hadn't been applying that technology, we hadn't been applying those platforms, and we hadn't been applying those strategies to the women's movement. So our sort of bet was that there are millions of people who are with us on these issues, but they're not being reached in the moment that they've been inspired or outraged to take action that has a credible shot at making a difference. And so we brought this theory, which was pretty plausible, frankly, in retrospect. but we yeah. So we brought this theory to a lot of early stage kind of, or who we were hoping would be early stage investors, I guess I should say. And we ran into all of the same things that you've heard from Rose and others who spoke earlier, which is that without proof of concept, there's very little there in the certainly in the nonprofit community to invest in something new. And in fact, I think the real instinct is to say, do we really need something new? Isn't there something that already exists that could be modified to do this thing, to fill this gap? So while we may agree on the analysis, we may agree that this solution is worth trying, we aren't sure, A, that you're the right people to do it, or B, that we really need a new institution to do this thing. Yeah. Well, actually, you do, is what we sort of learned. And part of the reason that you do is because particularly when we're talking about building new technology, leveraging that technology to have an impact on a social change level and also a political level, it matters what kinds of structure exists to support that new technology. So it is not designed to be executed based on a committee decision, for example, right? Like it's a very, rapid response is really what it is. When story breaks at 8 a.m., we need to be out to our members testing a response by 10 in order to be in the middle of the news story by that afternoon. Mm-hmm. And if you're not helping to shape, and the value of this model is that you are shaping the story on the front end. Which means that almost all of the existing institutions just aren't designed to move that way. And that's a really, really good thing, actually, from a policy perspective and a long-term change perspective. What we're doing is risky. Yeah. That's why it's called risk capital.
And are you guys a for or nonprofit?
We're a nonprofit, okay. Yeah. We have a 501c3 and a 501c4. And so really, like what it cost in terms of cash in hand to make this thing happen. We launched in February of 2012 with the Komen Foundation scandal. You might remember this.
Yeah, no, I got that one.
Right, so for those who don't remember, they tried to defund Planned Parenthood's breast health program. People everywhere were outraged. We were the first to come out with a petition saying, with the support of Move On and Credo, because we had nothing at the time. We just had this idea, and they said, okay, can you run with this for us? Because we've got a lot of other campaigns we're running. We said, sure. We demanded that they reverse that decision, and 1 million petition signatures later, a couple of weeks later, and 2 protests later, they were forced to reverse that decision. We then took it a step further, which is something not Planned Parenthood, not anybody could have done, right, in this context, and said, actually, the architect behind this decision, Karen Handel, is a right-wing, very far right-wing political operative. This was a politically motivated decision. They are bringing politics directly into this subject of what should be apolitical women's health, and forced her to resign a couple of weeks later. So not only are we able to move quickly, which is critical to the outcome often, right, when opportunities emerge for making change, but we are also in a position, because of the way that we are designed, to take calculated risks, which is to say that we are not just satisfied with imposing an immediate, with getting what our initial ask looks like. We are satisfied when we have imposed a cost for sexism in this case, but for others, I think the right way to put it is just a cost for undermining people. Yeah.
And when we were discussing the panel, one of the things I thought was interesting was the struggles that you've had in talking about the differentiation between offline organizing and online organizing. And if you could talk a little bit about that and trying to explain to people that it's not different, it's the same thing.
Sure. So it has been the case that since we've launched, right, we have been really lucky to been able to work with some really smart, really motivated program officers who have wanted to figure out how to fund this work, even if the model is challenged somewhat by our, frankly, inability to fit into the proposal model. We do our best, obviously, but we can't always predict exactly who our target's going to be, exactly which costs we're going to extract, exactly how many people we are going to, who are going to be engaged in that fight, and precisely what that outcome is going to look like. And that's tough. That's tough for foundations for obvious reasons. But because we have been able to kind of work and come up with a model that I think is starting to work for a number of foundations, we've started to engage in another conversation, which is how can you, or the way it starts typically is, how can we work with you to work with our other grantees who do more, let's say, traditional organizing. Some call it, just straight field. Some call it community organizing. We really don't have a language, frankly, to distinguish between online-based, which some often rapid response, but not always rapid response. Sometimes it's longer term, versus what I heard somebody call the other day, which I thought was really rude, actually, which is pre-internet organizing.
That sounds like so like, let me tell you about life before the internet. This is how we organize. But it's the same principle.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Right. It's all organizing. It's just different tools, right? But what I think is interesting about the question is that it assumes that because we use resources in a different way. You could argue that there is greater efficiency, right, in leveraging technology to engage people in a campaign that's going to extract some outcome, like in the immediate term. There's an assumption that is somehow better or more desirable, I think, in some people's eyes, to the longer term kind of really hard work, frankly, of investing in organizers on the ground. And I think this is really scary, to be honest. I don't think that we are successful in the online space without the years, decades work of community organizing that happens on the issues that we are that we need people to fundamentally understand in order to be ready to take action when there is a moment to leverage power. And so, you know what I'm talking about. So I think, look, for me, and maybe it might be the case that people in this room are having this conversation all the time. For us, this is a new conversation, and it's an opportunity I wasn't expecting to have when we got into this space. I just figured people understood roles, they understood how they work together.
Funny that.
Right?
No.
And that doesn't appear to be the case. But I feel like we and those of us who are now kind of moving into this space who can help to kind of demystify the strategy and the thinking and the theory of change around this kind of work and help bridge it with the theory of change and the strategy with the more traditional community-based field organizing is going to be a really, really important thing to kind of figure out, build consensus around, and help figure out how to fund. Because all of it needs to happen if we are going to win.
No small problem to come.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Shaunna. Next up, we're going to hear from Jake Brewer. Jake is leading global external affairs for change.org, which means he's responsible for working with leaders in business and government around the world who receive petitions from change.org's 80 million users. He's also the co-founder and board president of Define American with Jose Antonio Vargas, where their work who has had their work show up on the cover of Time and recently released and is under Oscar consideration, CNN Films documentary called Documented. Take it away, Jake.
Thank you. This is really exciting. NEO, or what was formerly Public Interest Project, has funded or been part of work that I've done for the last couple of years, so really thankful to be here and thankful for you guys and all the work that you guys do. I'm going to try to get to the front of this chair because it's a very deep one. So I thought I'd share 3 things that we're kind of thinking about and in many ways are challenges that we need help with as we're thinking about technology and philanthropy. And the first is that technology is not easy, but it is probably the easiest part of social change as we've experienced it. So we've got a platform that's got 80 million users. It's pretty successful. It's actually quite successful, not just for social change organizations, but just for an internet tech company, period. It's taken us about 7 years to figure this out. We're on, I think, our 5th business model. So it takes a lot of trying of a lot of different things. But at this point, there's 1,000 new petitions started every day from 196 countries. We do it in 12 languages. And that's all very exciting. But the technology is a support infrastructure, and what we really need to be thinking through in many cases is actually like the process hacking. So people think about hackers and they think about technology, but really the systems that relate to social change and how our technology kind of infiltrates that or works with it or changes it entirely, works around it is a lot of what we need to rethink next. And so how philanthropy relates to that, I think is tough. And part of the reason it's tough is because when I say technology is hard, but social change is actually the harder part, I often think about any like math nerds, any people like really serious math or engineering nerds. Come on, this is a problem. Actually, frankly, this is a problem. So,
girl out there.
Hey, folks, in philanthropy, you need to understand technology and engineering, which means some people in this room should be engineers. In math, there's actually a systemic difference between something that's complicated and complex. And so rocket science is really hard, but it's a complicated system. You can actually solve for every single variable, right? So you have this much weight, you need to push this much thrust to break gravity, and you can get into space. It's actually not that difficult. A complex system is any system that involves humans, right? So like weather is you can't solve for weather. You can only kind of like maybe guide or shape it or like adjust to what it does to you. And humans are that thing. And so when we're building technology, we can't solve humans. What we can do when we're working on social change is to guide and shape and think through how our systems and our technology can do that. So one of the ways, as an example, that we'd really love help is thinking through, Deanna talked about, we start and sign petitions on our site. That's what people do, again, 1,000 times a day. And we've done that really, really well. This is a really old system, but the only innovation in the petition since the founding of the petition, I think the Imperial Chinese were like the first to use this, literally thousands of years ago. And the big change happened when, I'm pointing to Shaunna and her connection to MoveOn, was when he took it from offline to online. That's basically the single biggest change in what it's meant to do petition work, what it's meant for this most basic of democratic acts. And so we have an opportunity now to say, instead of building this massive megaphone, which is very loud, and the people on the receiving end who are required for the participation, or their participation is required to create change, instead of just yelling at them, we want to work with them. But that simple shift from at to with that our technology needs to allow for is an incredibly complex system that philanthropists need to start getting involved in, not just funding platforms or apps or technology, but really deeply understanding the systems. The other piece is that we're learning, and I think experimenting with and failing at and succeeding and failing again, is really this idea that at scale, you can't hide from gray areas. And so I was actually talking to a guy at Facebook who's worked with policy, and so they have 1.3 billion users. Their 0.3 is still 5 times bigger than all of our users. So they basically deal with every permutation of every problem you can conceive of. So at 1 billion users, let's just start there. Let's say you solve a problem 99.9% of the time. You've been so successful, you solved 99.9. Your 0.1 is still 1 million problems at 1 billion users, right? So as we're actually engaging all these people, the math of these problems starts to get really challenging. And so really deeply considering the values that you apply to those policies and how you actually govern those platforms and how individuals are engaging through technology and how philanthropists align with that and are able to fund different experiments and failures in some cases and bets around this is something else to be thinking about. And then, Rose, I think, spoke to this as well as I possibly could, but I'll add to it. The social good sector is just way behind in figuring out its structures and systems. Yeah. So basically, you start a company, you want to do some good in the world, you have 2 choices. And basically, they're dictated by the IRS. So why we're still taking, why we're letting the IRS figure out how we are going to solve our problems, right? It's like, so you get to be a nonprofit, actually technically a not-for-profit, but we call them a nonprofit. Or you get to be for-profit. So we want to be a social good company, which means we want to be for impact. We want to make revenue. We want to have a business model that works. But our point is not for profit. Our point is to be there for impact. And you just don't have many choices around this. So even in talking to folks, they're like, but really you're for profit, so we really can't trust you, right? Then you're like, but we're a nonprofit. If we were a nonprofit, then it's like, well, you can't scale. If you can name a single technology company that is scaled around the world that has millions of users that's really, really effective, great. Let's start to figure that out. But it just doesn't work when it comes to hiring world-class engineers, to scaling a system that has, again, multiple translations and languages and cannot be compared to other nonprofit work, but can be compared to Facebook and Google and Twitter and beyond that level of a technological platform. So we need help. If we were to put together the entire market cap of all social good companies, my guess, just my anecdotal guess, is probably less than $1 billion. Mm-hmm. And $1 billion as a market cap for all the companies that do this is less than 1/100th of the market cap of one for-profit tech company. Yeah. Right? In the nonprofit sector, by contrast, roughly $300 billion in charitable contributions every year, roughly $1 trillion in economic activity. So like even that is very different. And we have this one weird niche space that's trying to be in the middle that just needs support. It needs philanthropist investment. The Omidyar network, I just really want to praise them, Stacey Donahue in particular, who really thinking through what they can do and saying, we don't really care that much if you're nonprofit or for-profit. We want to invest in your team. We want to invest in your idea. Mm-hmm. And we're going to invest in potentially some failures in you. And that's a really important thing that I hope people in this room will join us in figuring out.
Yay. So. Thanks, Jake. Also, I'm going to tap you later to explain to some of the the people that I'm dating the difference between complex and complicated.
Deanna is not a linear system, people.
I am not a linear system. So if I could just tap you on that later.
Yeah, I'm in. Yeah.
Bringing up, rounding it out is my very good friend Samhita Mukhopadhyay, and Samhita is the Director of Strategic Engagement and Communications at what? The National Women's Business Council, which is a nonpartisan advisory council to the White House, Congress, and Small Business Association. Prior to that, she was on the strategy team at Purpose, a New York City-based consulting firm focusing on social causes, and she is also the former executive editor of the award-winning website feministing.com. Whoop, whoop. Samhita,
Thanks,
tell us what is happening in your end of the world.
What is happening? Okay, about my dating life? No.
Yeah, well.
We haven't caught up in a while. This is so exciting. What an exciting panel to be on. I can't believe this is even the first time you and I have been on a panel together in kind of thinking about the sector and what I've learned. So what I will talk most about right now is kind of my work with feministing and what we kind of learned about funding or lack thereof, and passion projects and their limits, and ultimately measuring impact, which is what I'm really interested in right now in my current work. So feministing was founded in 2004. That makes us like grandparents in the internet. Like you have no idea how many like kids are like, I read you in high school, and I'm like, great. That feels great. It does kind of feel great, but we've obviously seen tremendous shifts in the last 10 years. It's our 10-year anniversary of feministing, and kind of when feministing was founded, it was founded by this woman, Jessica Valenti, and her sister, Vanessa, and they kind of Googled young women on the internet and got a 10-year-old HTML page that just had some out-of-date stats about young women. I mean, that was like the level of engagement that was happening using kind of internet tools. And if you remember 2004, this is kind of when blogs started to get really popular. Howard Dean was like, the internet's a tool, and so it was kind of this exciting moment. And that was when you had all these conferences, and the big question at Netroots was, where are the lady bloggers, right? So I actually remember my first conference at Netroots on a panel, which I would be like offended if I was asked to do that panel today, where are the lady bloggers? Yeah. So our motivation to kind of start was really almost everyone that was at Feministing as an activist, was a feminist activist, really came out of that space. And we had been told by older feminists that there were no young feminists. Like we were too obsessed with thongs and lipstick, and there was no we were not engaged in the kind of issues that impacted our lives. And we were like, we're gonna show you otherwise. And so very quickly learned that was obviously not true. There was a broad group of kind of young women that were deeply engaged in the issues that impacted their life. They just had nowhere to kind of go to talk about it, right? So feminism at that point was not an exciting thing. It was a dirty word, right? And the 90s slowly saw a resurgence of kind of girl power and riot girl, but really the 80s had kind of won, right? In terms of the public perception of feminism. And what I always say is like, what better way to convince women not to do something than telling them that they won't get laid if they identify as it, which has been the kind of most effective anti-feminist messaging ever.
By the way, the opposite is true, but we can talk about that another
time. Also that, yes. we can have a sidebar on that, because I also wrote a book about dating a couple of years ago and being a feminist. So anyway, we obviously learned there was this mass of women that were engaged in this issue. The other thing that we learned was there was that the very controversial notion that women should have equal access to all parts of society was also a very hated and contested notion still. And so while we were proving that there was a ton of feminists out there, we were also uncovering this dark belly of humanity that still did not want us to thrive and succeed. So just imagine our surprise in that moment. That there was this like tremendous opportunity. And so we realized, and I think feministing became, and it started as a platform for young women to speak their truths, and it really evolved into this opportunity to change public perception of what it meant to be a young woman in contemporary society. And has since then become hotly contested, right? In terms of all the different types of identities that we really need to be considering when we talk about a cohesive feminist movement. And so, through that work, we obviously learned and saw quantifiable impact, right? But it was really hard to measure. So all of a sudden, mainstream media cares about women's issues. Like, who knew, right? And in a lot of ways, we could trace that to this kind of like buzzing online feminist activism that was happening in online kind of dialogue and engagement that was happening with young women. And I've made the joke a couple of times that I take credit for Beyonce owning feminism, but but kind of Jezebel and these other really large platforms that brought these issues to the mainstream, or even the political blogosphere, where you were always one click away from a potential kind of feminist site. So while we were seeing that there was this tremendous opportunity to kind of engage the public and kind of do the work so that UltraViolet could actually engage a readied audience and kind of build these consciousness groups, that work needed to happen, but it was really hard to kind of identify and quantify it to make the case for philanthropy, philanthropic efforts, right, or for funding. And so I cannot even, that made me laugh, the like tax bracket, because I cannot tell you how many feministing retreats we were like, are we a nonprofit, are we a for-profit? And it was really hard to figure it out because most of our backgrounds had been in nonprofit activism. But we realized that we had a tech platform. We needed investment. We had an unfunded startup, basically, that was a media platform. And so, a couple of years ago, we launched a very controversial paper where some former members of Feministing did research with the Barnard Center for Women on Research and launched a paper called Fem Future, which essentially made the case for why funders need to really look at these nimble and new models of organizing that sometimes aren't as quantifiable as the kind of, and I think with email advocacy, the exciting thing is you have measurement and you have number, and I think we're still trying to also figure that out for media platforms that are not exactly kind of media journalist platforms and are not exactly kind of like online advocacy platforms either. And so I think so our hope was to kind of bring some innovation into that intersection, right? Because we really still need this kind of consciousness raising work. The response to the paper actually was overwhelming and overwhelmingly negative. And one of the, I think, biggest lessons that we learned is that there's actually a tremendous amount of suspicion to bringing the language of innovation, entrepreneurship, technology, and funding to the kind of gully internet of like, this is my space, I belong here, this is my identity, you didn't include this, or all of these different conversations which take up way too much of all of our time, I actually think. So I think we hit this critical juncture where we didn't really know that, like, in many ways, the community that we were hoping to really engage around this real big disparity in funding for women's spaces on the internet, we're actually rejecting our kind of ideas and solutions to that. And so, and I almost present that to you as I am at an impasse, right? Like, I am not exactly sure, but I do know from my work at Feministing that it has been the most transformative thing for feminism in our generation and for my own life and my own career, but also for young feminists. Like, it has been one of the most transformative things for bringing kind of a obsolete concept or idea to bringing it to a kind of current and new audience that's deeply engaged and ready and motivated. And I think the Susan G. Komen example was one of the first and most public and perfect examples of this kind of ready, primed, and willing audience that was ready to take you down. And it was, do not mess with the online feminist mafia, right? And there was such an excitement and a power to that. But I think one of the biggest cases that Courtney and Vanessa, who kind of authored the paper, made was, as long as we can't figure out how to bring the funding to these kind of nimble, exciting moments, we are still going to have this, we are still going to be stuck with kind of uncreative activist opportunities that are great, and I think that we all respect deeply kind of grassroots organizing and establishment feminism and all of those things that like came before us and we build our work on top of. But at the same time, like, we will not have the opportunity to kind of really respond and capitalize on these moments that are so exciting, and this disparity in funding is going to continue happening. So.
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to just high five all the way down?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. High five. In hearing what what we were talking about this morning and what everyone seems to have kind of touched on is this whole idea of measurement and the ability to measure impact. And this is what I feel like every kind of tech, social change, media convening that I've been at in the last 6 months specifically is like, great, we can tweet, but what does that actually mean, and how do we measure impact? One of the things that I'm thinking about, and something that we do at Lux, like we hate it when somebody says like, this tweet reached 3 million people. That doesn't actually mean anything, like like so what? So who cares, And so one of the things that we talk about is how do we figure out how to use data to tell the story of how change gets made. And actually, Susan G. Komen was a really good example for us. I sort of accidentally created a Tumblr blog called Planned Parenthood Saved Me, because the conversation had become so much about money and who was going to donate money to Planned Parenthood and who was going to take away money from Planned Parenthood. I was like, there's this emotional response that we're kind of missing by making this just about numbers, and what happens to women who are going to be most affected by the loss of these services when they don't have any money to donate or not donate. There has to be a way for those folks to contribute to the conversation. So I set up this blog that where you could submit stories of how Planned Parenthood had changed your life in some way, and it was, it's a moderated thing with Tumblr, and so you get these like submissions in, and then you go through them and you deny them. We got almost no trolling, by the way, which was kind of crazy. Like almost no haters showed up and were like, blah, 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 like abortion, blah, There was like 5 out of the several hundred stories that we got. And most of them were just me sitting there just like bawling the entire time, like these amazing stories of the incredible work that Planned Parenthood does on the front of healthcare and women that is just so lacking, right? And so I wanted to talk about how that was meaningful, or how that helped make change. And it wasn't just a matter of saying like, we got 300 stories, we got these numbers. I can sit there and rattle off all of those numbers, but what ultimately became the more interesting story was that we got, so for example, we got 30,000 page views, I think, or visits in the first 3 days of the blog being up there, which was nice. And more than 60% of that traffic, though, came from social. It came from Tumblr, Twitter, and Facebook. It came from people sharing their stories with one another. And so something that we might consider traditionally as a metric of success, the fact that it was on the Rachel Maddow show, it was in the New York Times, it was in Salon and the Washington Post, all things that traditionally would be like, that means we were successful and we did something because the mainstream establishment paid attention to it. That actually only contributed to 20% of the traffic, ultimately. And I thought, when it was on Maddow, first of all, my head popped off and like rolled down the hallway because I was just like, I love you, and you're reading from my blog on your. It was really fantastic, and so I like. Nerd that I am, like I ran to the analytics and I'm like waiting for things to just shoot through the roof, and it didn't actually. That was not where people were coming from. People were coming from sharing their stories with one another. And so those are the ways that I think about how we can start to transform the idea of what impact actually means versus saying I raised X amount of dollars, or I got this many visits, or had this many people. So I'd love to hear, kind of what you guys think about and what metrics you're thinking about as far as measurement, and how that intersects with funders and getting your stories told. And anybody can jump in at any time. Interrupt one another too. I'd love that.
One that we really like. So the big numbers, kind of like traffic and like the number of users, is often the thing that people will call out. But actually the metric that matters most to us as a company, and something we've chosen, is the number of our users that experience a victory. So of the 80 million users, about 25 million have experienced a victory as part of a petition. So they've either started it and people signed it and something happened in the real world, or they signed it and then it was declared a victory after. And of those, over 80% actually are less than 100 signatures. So they're very small. These are not like, they're usually smaller things. I mean, every day, we get anybody use TVIs or like any like reports that you get about where stuff shows up in the media. And there'll be like WBRX Dothan, Alabama, and it's a mother who started a petition about something she wanted to change in her local school board. It's get covered in the news, and then something changes in the school board. 50 people sign it, which is all you need in Dothan, Alabama, for a school board, and it changes. And like that happening many, many, many times is the most important thing to us. And the other stuff helps, and it helps us understand how we're getting out there and how people have access to being empowered to change things. But that really is at the heart of it.
And what kind of response do you get from your investors and kind of money people with those?
They love that. I mean, I think in many ways the investors we have, and this I think also speaks to some of the challenge. We've also committed to never go public and to never sell the company. We've done that in Wall Street Journal. So it's like a very public thing that we've made a commitment to because we want to stay true to the values. That means there's really not a big exit event that people are looking for. And so most of the time, the investors are values aligned so much that they're looking for, potentially they'll make their money back, but they're not looking for big returns in the same way that a lot of venture capitalists traditionally would. And so they're actually looking for a way that's not just a donation like you would make through a foundation or a nonprofit, but is an investment for impact that also can deliver return, and they love the fact that it actually delivers impact.
Great. Shaunna, you wanted to add something?
Well, sure. So did I look expectant?
No, yeah, you looked like you were going to jump in.
You're reading my mind. So a couple of things. One is, so similarly, one of the easiest and most obvious ways of assessing whether we're successful is did we win the campaign or not, as the outset of the goal is stated. But when we're talking about impact with investors, which frankly is on the C3 side almost entirely foundations, it's on three levels. There's education, how many and exposure. How many people saw this infographic, which we now know from a lot of testing has a big influence on the way people think about issues, it turns out, which is interesting and surprising, but it's anyway. So is education, it's engagement. How many people participated and how many people shared that content? So not just did they sign the petition, but did they invite their community to participate as well, and did those people participate? And so then how did that impact the outcome? And then the outcome itself. What's interesting, or what's harder really, is on the subject of culture change. And so if part of our work, right, is about, part of our work, of course, is about naming a problem and attempting to fix it, whether this person needs to be fired or this bill needs to get passed. Like, we understand what a win looks like. When we're talking about long term, we want to be shifting our culture to create the conditions such that it's possible for better policies to be passed, for people to have better lives at work, at home, at school, et cetera. How do you measure that? And that's a big, actually, to be honest, a big open question that we are still kind of really working on with sociologists, we're working on with scientists, and there are a lot of theories about how you can start, what your kind of existing data can help tell you about the work that you're doing in order to measure culture shift over time. But for now, we're sort of betting right on a lot of different strategies that are contingent upon education reaching the most number of eyeballs, on the rapid response campaign. It's like impacting the way people think about power, the way they think about women, right? And then and hoping that the longer term thing is measurable over time.
Hoping for measurement should be like the next next title of like the next conference that we all go to is like it's like waiting for Godot, hoping for measurement. Exactly. Or waiting for Guffman, depending on your cultural reference points. Anybody else want to add to think about measurement metric?
It's hard.
Yeah, it's hard. That's the tweet right there, Jake Brewer. Yeah. It's hard.
Yeah, actually, one thing that might be worth adding, just as people are thinking about investing, is that we have the added burden that like a regular company or a regular nonprofit in some cases don't necessarily have. So if you're just trying to get users for eyeballs for advertising, that's like a lot of companies do that really well. Like Facebook does that extremely well. If then you're also trying to measure this extra thing, you have to do as good as they do, and you have to do something else. And I think that's like really important to keep in mind when you're potentially funding or working with these groups. Is it's just a lot of extra work that no one is getting right yet, and we have a lot of exploration to do as much as we have solutions.
Before I open it up to audience questions, y'all get ready with your brains. You ready to be interactive? Yes. One person is. Are you ready to be interactive? Yes, yes, yes. That's what I love to hear. If, surprise pop quiz question. If there was just one thing that you could convey to the folks in this room about this intersection of the work that you're specifically doing and the challenge that you face with funding and philanthropy models as they exist, what's the one thing that you would love to share with folks?
How
Fund
blunt
me.
can we?
Give me money, make it rain.
I think it would be to consider as an entry point, I think, into this space, because it is such uncharted territory, is like maybe a set of convenings or conversations where we can actually like bring some of these learnings, I think, to a broader group, and that kind of opportunity. Like, this is a tremendous opportunity to, I think, really start that conversation, but I do think education is a big piece of it. Like, we figured out that, one of the reasons that older feminists said there were no young feminists is because they hadn't looked it up on the internet, and so that was a big moment. And so I've actually had many older women come up to me at conferences and start crying and be like, I didn't know you existed. Like, I literally just didn't know.
Yeah.
So I think like convenings to actually have the difficult conversation of like, what does impact look like in this space, and what does it look like for a new generation that may not kind of, go be part of a traditional kind of like organizing model. And so I think that's a first entry point. And the second is, think about like the amounts that you could give. Some of these organizations are working on no budget at all. I mean, that's like
Literally.
feministing, like literally worked on no budget. Feminism owes me money. Like, anyone that says Beyonce, like anyone that says Beyonce talks about feminism because it helps her sell records is dripping. But thinking about even smaller amounts of money to some of these more experimental ideas, right? To some of these more kind of like experimental spaces, or apps. Like, I think Hollaback's app is a really good example, or some of these kind of like really experimental ideas, and thinking about smaller bits of money and how you can kind of just like give them a little bit of money and see what they can do with that, and you'd be shocked at what they can do with a small amount of money.
And I would actually love to give a shout out, one to my peeps at the Harnish Foundation, because I think that they're really, the models that they're going for are really spearheading, and check out their work. They're really amazing people, and Ruth Ann Harnish is just like one of the most awesome people on the planet, period. But also the work that they're doing with the Awesome Foundation and these newer, interesting models of philanthropy around smaller grants, and Awesome Without Borders, which is a project of the Harnish Foundation. Like, these are the conversations that I'm, I can't wait kind of for the questions part, because I want to hear like what you all are thinking about too.
The one thing?
Yeah.
And we're allowed to be very direct.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Real talk.
Dear
Hashtag real
Philanthropy,
talk.
as a group, you're way too slow, you're way too safe, and as a group, you consistently show that you don't get it when it comes to technology.
Well, there it is.
There you go.
He just threw down the gauntlet at you.
The money doesn't show up when we need it to take bets that we need to make in a very dynamically changing world. The people who are giving the money don't understand the
they're
technology they're funding, and you're not willing to take bets. You're not willing to make bets on necessary things, to try new areas of work that are required to solve problems that haven't already been solved. You can't use an old solution to solve a new problem, and that means you got to try new things, and sometimes they don't work.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, I have a sunnier view, slightly.
As a group. Some of you
And
are
this is in part because I was just a part of a conversation led by, some of you may have been a part of it, by Jenny Toomey at the Ford Foundation. I'm sure others are having similar conversations. What does a technology-funded enterprise of some kind look like? And I think that's, it's exciting that the question is even being asked. What I would say is, and my takeaway from the conversation, is that there isn't enough emphasis on resourcing the practitioners to determine, dictate, commission, whatever, the tools. Right now, tools are kind of being developed over here, and we're over here trying to figure out how to make it work for what we do. And then when we see a gap in the tech, it takes a year to get that thing built. It's unacceptable. I mean, we're leaving opportunities on the table, people on the table, et cetera. So that, I would like to fix that.
Leaving people on it. I love that.
I'll start by saying that I agree with a lot of what has been said here, even though it might, feel shocking. And maybe I'll throw out a kind of practical suggestion around metrics and considering metrics differently at what stage they are being delivered from. So in the tech startup investing world, if you're trying to raise a Series A or growth capital, you need metrics. You need to demonstrate that you've been able to achieve your goals, that you have a business model that's working, that's scaling, that's achieving the impact you want. But those same metrics within the tech investment world are not required in the early stage for seed and angel investment. No business plans are required. In fact, our first lead investor, he says he will never read a business plan. We spent all of our time working on our pilot, working on our actual product. We didn't have metrics. And I feel that unfortunately that stopped a lot of the foundations and philanthropists that we talked to from investing in us. And we really needed your support because we really value your perspective. So tying that back to my earlier suggestion around, I think the philanthropy community needs the equivalent of an angel investor that doesn't have a lot of strings attached, that can distribute money very quickly. And if that is not something that we can give the authority to partners or whatever it's called within the philanthropic community, maybe it's foundations giving a grant to a formerly successful social entrepreneur who started Teach for America. Give that entrepreneur a fund, $5 million, and say, I want you to write checks of $10,000 to anyone, to any group that you see that you think could benefit from this money, and find ways of distributing that money at much earlier stages, because it's desperately needed, and your voice and perspective is desperately needed in the early stages, and it's just not shining through. At first I thought it was just me, and I've talked to so many entrepreneurs, and it's the same story over and over. And at the same time, we hear how much money there is out there, and you guys can't give it out fast enough. I mean, it's like, does everybody know about this? Like, it's like, I almost can't believe that this is some kind of problem that we're having. Like, give the money out faster would be my awesome call to action.
Faster. It kind of reminds me, there's a story about the Maharishi Yogi, and he had these like grand plans for these new ideas and like this whole new program, and one of his staff members was totally freaking out, and they said, but Yogi, where's the money going to come from? And he just looked at them and said, from wherever it is now. And I really feel like that is our challenge at this intersection, is creating the pathways that this stuff flows. So with that, let's open it up to questions. Oh, I see Mr. Mika Sifri would like to speak with us.
Hi. Great panel, thank you. I'm going to ask a question that Jake knows what's coming. So Jake, you wrote a really, really good article a few years ago in the Huffington Post called "The Tragedy of Advocacy," and I built on that in my book, The Big Disconnect, because I'm worried that I'm all with you. I want to see more investment in innovative, creative solutions using new kinds of technology. There's a lot of promise here. But I'm really worried that you're not addressing one of the sort of side effects of all your good work, which is separately, you're each destroying our most precious resource, which is our collective attention. There's a reason why email open rates are going down. There's a reason why the optimization in A/B testing, it's like leaving a lot of people untouched because we're all overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. And there's this problem of groups sort of using metrics now to really emphasize their own sort of, well, we did this. Whether the larger issue was dramatically changed, we have group-based metrics rather than movement-level metrics. Mm-hmm. So, and I see some signs of how we can get out of that trap, but I'm wondering if you would address it, because I don't think it's safe just to say throw money at tech, that'll be good. Because we can also throw a lot of money at bad tech solutions. I'm seeing that right now with people, pouring money into things like Brigade, which is going to, waste millions and millions of dollars. But hell, no one can tell Sean Parker he's an idiot because he's a billionaire. So,
I can.
okay, you can. So anyway, could Jake, this is your idea in part, not just yours, but how do we fix for the problem of this tragedy of advocacy that we're kind of polluting the commons?
Leave it to me to ask the hardest thing possible.
I was like, maybe
all,
I should have saved you for later.
Yeah, right. To run his own panel. So first of all, I think it starts with naming it, and I think that's part of the issue, and we are aware of it as a challenge, and actually being able to talk about it and have specific ideas. I think this is something that UltraViolet does in particular. That bringing a name to something that people can address is one of the first steps in the problem. Actually, one of the first things that Mika asked me when I joined Change.org was, didn't you write an article about how basically things like Change.org are the problem? And I said, yes. And the issue, I don't think, is that Change.org is inherently a problem of being over-amplified. So quick step back. If you go to a member of Congress and you say, hey, how are petitions working to get you to change your mind? They'll tell you that they're not. They'll say that they get too many emails and they get too much stuff coming at them from all these advocacy groups, and that actually makes them go talk to lobbyists who are easy to talk to and are just one-on-one that they have a relationship with. So basically, by doing our work really well in some cases, we actually create more of the problem we're trying to solve against. And so that was kind of the premise. And so when we talk about the technology as kind of the easy part, like building a system that people can use is hard. But it's easier than like rethinking how a decision maker is going to help a citizen change something, that we have to influence that system itself in the way that the decision makers participate, or the way that citizens are educated to understand their place in that system. And we don't know the answer yet, but I think part of the thing we're trying to figure out is how do we work on that in a sustainable way, in a way that doesn't also blow up what does work, and experiment. And so one of the things that I said before, this idea of transitioning our platform from a thing where people speak at decision makers as loud as they can into a place where there can be engagement and dialogue and working towards some kind of solution is what we're trying to do right now. And it's just, I'll tell you, I've been at it for a year and experimenting it, and a lot of team members working on it as well. And we have a long way to go. We're like on step 3 of 20. So no answers, but thoughts and intention.
And I'd like to jump in with a quick side comment. Mika, I don't think that it's just that we need to fund early stage tech startups. I think we just need more early stage innovation funding. And I see broadening the pipeline from the very beginning. It's so much easier in tech. Like, forget about the social impact tech, but if you're just like straight tech, you go to some hackathon and there's investors there, you go to some early pitch competition, there's like, the pipeline is just, it's like so much more well-oiled. And I think we're seeing some really cool projects. Like in New York, there's a group called Significance Labs that's doing incubator funding and support. It doesn't even matter what kind of entity you are, whether you're a for-profit, nonprofit, or just a creative project. I think that's really cool. In San Francisco, Tipping Point is starting to do an internal incubator as well, and I saw their COO present on it, and she spent a lot of time talking about how we might fail. A lot of these are just experiments, and that feeling of needing to explain why failure is okay. Failure shouldn't just be okay. Failure is necessary for us to really have the freedom to innovate and experiment and to find where the solutions actually are. So yeah, not just tech, but early stage funding across the board.
More questions? Like 8,000.
Yeah.
Yay. So we'll go here, and I want to make sure that folks we'll do you next, back there.
I'm Billy Easton. I'm the executive director of the Alliance for Quality Education. I don't know, maybe I'm one of the dinosaurs with the cigar in my mouth saying, let me talk to you about the pre-internet organizing. But I do think that it's the history of community organizing and the strength of it is extremely important. I think that it is very important that it is up to date and able to take advantage of the edgy high-tech platforms that exist. And I think there are different skill sets often in the face-to-face type organizing with the high-tech piece, and I think the strongest is the combination of both. But I think that there is a a real difference between the language of social justice and the language of social good, you know? Because I think there's a fundamental issue of who is any type of work, whatever the methodology, accountable to. And if we're talking about racial and economic justice, I mean, the historic model of community organizing is that it's accountable to the people who are most affected, okay? I think that the reason there is some concern about a sort of a private market model is it's not accountable to those people. And in fact, we see it in the area of education where entrepreneurs, hedge fund billionaires, have an agenda they believe in strongly and is driving most of the public education debate right now, which most people in the communities that we serve think is incredibly damaging.
Yeah, I just,
So
for
my
the
question
sake of
real
time,
quick
yeah.
would be, you know, I think really sort of in the line of what Shaunna talked about, what ideas to make the technology, the edgy technology, usable by organizations that are traditional community organizing groups, so it's accountable to the people it's supposed to benefit.
Questions of accountability.
I can speak
Yes.
a little bit, yeah. So I think you speak to a lot of really right points in terms of accountability and kind of grassroots organizing being accountable to the people that they're actually organizing. I also think that, you know, one of the things I definitely learned with, and after feministing, I've done a lot of online organizing as well, is, you know, we kind of need numbers too. So, if like, I think Ferguson is a really good example of the kind of activism that happened with Ferguson, Missouri. I don't necessarily know that Obama would have mentioned it in any of his speeches if like it wasn't completely the trending topic for 5 days straight on Twitter, right? Like I think there was an impact to that. I think where the opportunity is often online organizers are shut out of grassroots organizing conversations, and a lot of these big organizations need to create space. And I was thinking this is another funding opportunity, actually, is some collaboration between those two, right? Because I know Color of Change, like Rashad is all over the country, but he could have easily been invited to some of the meetings that were happening in Ferguson on the ground. And so, you know, maybe we need to start really thinking about how we build these coalitions. And I think online organizing groups really need to be represented in that, rather than trying to recreate the infrastructure. The infrastructure already exists. So a partnership would be a much more effective and cost-effective way to maximize both kind of strengths, right?
Yeah.
Community organizers should not learn now how to do online advocacy. That's a whole other skill set, right? So how can we kind of really overlap those things? And I do think there's a huge opportunity for innovation there. And I think a lot of these leaders are thinking about that. We're thinking about that very critically, like, because often we come from activist backgrounds too, understanding that, and this kind of speaks to, like, I think email open rates aren't necessarily going down because people don't have attention rates. I think because they get too many emails that don't lead to anything, right? And so if you get an email and that, like, you know, the perfect example is when UltraViolet, and you can speak to this too, actually got Reebok to drop Rick Ross through an email campaign and digital activism. People, I'm sure, you know, you can speak to that, the increased engagement on your list from that.
Sure. Thanks. Rick Ross, a very famous rapper, huge Twitter following, if you don't know him. So more mainstream than your typical. Point is, he released a single in which he was rapping about, sort of bragging about drugging and raping a woman.
Like you do.
There was a response in the blogging community to this song. We thought, what can we, like, what might we test with our members to see what they would want to do to just name that this is not okay, right? And we started looking at his relationships with corporations and saw that he had an endorsement deal with Reebok. Reebok would spend an enormous amount of money marketing around women's empowerment. We felt like there were two arguments to be made. One is we don't, you know, that our members ultimately wanted to make, which is one that we shouldn't be rewarding people who are popularizing and sort of propagating rape culture, and with endorsement deal dollars, and we should hold companies accountable who associate themselves with this kind of content. So we launched this campaign. It was one of our most successful in the last couple of years since we've existed. 60,000 people signed that petition in a couple of days. That's for our larger petitions. That's not. It's a big number for us. We have 600,000 members. We are not multi-million, and I don't even know how many members you guys have at this point, but it's a lot. In any case, 600,000 members. We're in every single state and every congressional district, but 60,000 is a lot in 2 days. But more importantly, these people were so motivated by the opportunity, which was not about passing a bill. It was not about, it was not about impacting a piece of legislation or a piece of policy, but it was a social change, and I would argue there was a social justice aspect to this campaign, right? And it was motivating, and so yeah, we grew by 20,000 people in a couple of days with this campaign, and ultimately at the end, Reebok not only dropped their endorsement deal with Rick Ross, but put out a statement saying it is because he clearly doesn't understand the impact that his statements are having on women.
Awesome.
Yeah.
We actually only have time we're actually out of time, but I want to take one more question because I promised the person in the back, and then we'll wrap it up.
Great point.
Hi, thank you. My name is Keisha Gaskins. I work with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and possibly one of the funders that just don't get it, and so I'm here to learn. I have one thought and then a really big question. And, when I think about, say, Ferguson, for example, and I do remember Rashad actually being on the ground.
Yeah, I was going to say, he actually did go.
He was there.
He was there. I thought about that later. I was like, he actually was there, but
he was there,
that
and he was
example
part of those
there.
conversations. And I think the bigger challenge had a lot to do with old school on-the-ground organizers being really unwilling to cede public space to the young people that were actually putting their bodies on the line in Ferguson. But that's a different conversation. I want to talk about failure. And the idea of failing, I think, is really important, how we learn from failure. There's a lot of conversation now about failing fast, and I'm trying to understand more about failing smart. Mm-hmm. And how do we take that idea of saying, look, let's do some early investment, let's do some proof of concept, let's get some things out here in a space that we haven't seen before, right? The idea of working in tech is not just the idea of saying, how do we do things that we've done before better, stronger, faster, but how do we do things we have never been able to do before because we're operating in this tech space, and because of that, we are going to be failing more. But what I struggle with a lot is trying to fail smart. How do we look at the metrics? How do we determine what we've learned and take that learning to apply it again when so much of the space does, like the space itself, be very multinodal, ultimately lots of different leadership? How do we define some sort of scope to help us understand if we're going to be funding early efforts, if we know we're going to be funding a lot of failure, how do we fail smart? And how do we try and integrate that learning into future investment opportunities?
So one thing that I want to say is that I think that there's still a lot of work to be done destigmatizing failure, in that educating both funders and entrepreneurs that failing smarter is an option, first of all. I think that there's a huge amount of work to be done. A few years ago, a friend of ours, Katrine Verklas, anybody know her? She started a thing called Failfare, which was a regular meeting of people getting together, working in the social justice space of ICT and technology, to discuss the things that had gone horribly wrong. And it was almost like an AA meeting. It was like it was Fight Club. You didn't talk about your failures outside of this one space. And so it's like, how are we actually going to start sharing our stories of, this is where I went horribly awry, without risking that no one's ever going to fund me ever again. So I would love to hear some ideas on destigmatization as well.
I'll just throw out one idea is that investing in networks that support early stage entrepreneurs, where they can tap into knowledge and resources, like some of the new incubators we're seeing, like Tumble for Urban Impact, Rock Health, in the health space, and there are other ones out there. I was with a health startup, went through Rock Health, the knowledge sharing, getting contacts, talking to people who've done the idea before and failed. Like, I still am, do a labor of love of meeting founders who are trying to do digital health behavior change, because I feel that I owe it to the community to share what I've learned. But investing in those networks that entrepreneurs tap into is my suggestion.
I would say something super, super simple, which is when we hear directly from the funder that they want to be involved in learning about how we've failed. like that it just opens up the conversation in such a really a phenomenal way from the beginning. So there's an understanding, like, you have a plausible theory for success. Where there's a hypothesis, we expect it to work. That's why we're investing in it. But if it doesn't, what the real value for us is what you've learned from that. And so we know that, like, it's the learning that matters, and that's what we get to do with you.
Yeah, and just building on that, I would just add, I think often the goal of philanthropy seems to be that you're looking for answers. I actually think shifting that in as many cases as possible to asking better questions. So our goal over the next 2 months is to ask these questions, get as close to we can to the answers. In some cases, the answer is, that was the wrong question, and we need to actually shift again. And so, I mean, in Silicon Valley, they call it a pivot, they call it being agile, they call it any number of things. And the philanthropic sector is about as far from those two words as anything can be, I think. In many ways, it's a large structure. So being agile, asking better questions versus having answers might be a way to put a pin in some of that.
Yeah, I really like the language of experimentation as opposed to failure, right? So you try something, and it was an experiment, and it didn't go the way that you thought it was going to go. I also think that in the work that we're doing, failure is kind of inevitable. Like, we are going to fail. And interestingly, I appreciate your question, because the National Women's Business Council, our theme for the month is Fail Forward, but it's really working with women entrepreneurs around this idea of failure as a necessary step to starting a successful business. And so one of the things that I've recognized in my own work, and also in kind of working with some of this research, is that most really successful entrepreneurs failed like 5 times before they had a successful business. And how do we kind of bring that language to this space? Because I do think there's specifically, like, especially for disenfranchised communities, there's this undue pressure that you have to be perfect out the gate, and that's outrageous. Whereas, like, other people get to make a lot of mistakes. And so there's a recognition, like, we are going to mess up and have messed up. And from that, as Shaunna's talking about, the learning is what's going to actually evolve into the better solution.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have. And thank you so much for your time and brains and contributions and all of that stuff. And thank you to our panelists. And yay.
Thank you.
Thank you to our moderator.